But you stand from the vantage point of being both connected to and embedded within the community, but also an anthropologist. And anthropology has a peculiar and complex history with Indigenous peoples, shall we say. I mean, I often tell my students that anthropology cut its teeth studying and extracting data from Indigenous communities and made its major theoretical contributions based upon that. And so there is a legacy that comes with that process. Writing about people of the saltwater was a very interesting process. I mean, one of the things that initially happened very early on when I was doing my professional research, because I did work in Brittany and France, I did work in Ireland, I did work with industrial economy in British Columbia. And when I started doing research back home and then with First Nations communities, one of my aunts kind of took me aside and says, you need to write a book, which I thought, okay, I'm not quite sure. This is more of this kind of encouragement, because of course as an academic I know I have to write a book, but she meant it in a little bit different context about having to write a book and about that expectation. So it always kind of sat in the background of my mind. Though the book that emerged, People of the Saltwater, really came out of a process of being engaged in doing research and then seeing large-scale industrial developments coming down, like the Enbridge tar sands pipeline. And so the book initially emerged out of my research, but was shaped by the legal request to have an expert opinion about Gitxaaڵa rights and title and presence as part of its existence as a people in a community for many years. So hence the first four chapters really look at the place, the people, the law, and the history, and how the community is governed. And it was part of that thing, that driving force. So it was a kind of an interesting combination of being directed by community expectations on multiple levels, both in that sort of familial connections as well as the political connections, as well as my own actual personal interests, having grown up in the North Coast, spent my life on my father's fish boat working as a kid, as a young adult, and even I always like to jokingly say that I spent 1 year working on his boat with the government, subsidized by a government salary, so that he could keep fishing. And this is in the late 90s, and the change in regulation made it hard for guys to make money. In order to afford to fish, you had to have a salary in your back pocket. One of my sons came on some of our field work trips. Well, actually, both boys came on many of the different trips with me in different times through their lives. But he came with me on one of the archaeology trips we were doing and took some photographs. And we were looking for a cover of the book, and sometimes book publishers don't like the authors selecting images for the covers. They kind of want to have control over it. And I really insisted that I wanted it to speak from this place I was at. And so my son gave me a half dozen examples of pictures that he'd taken. And I really do like that one. If you open the book cover up to the full extent, you can see the whole shot on the west coast of Banks Island. It's a beautiful image, and and it really captures this on the edge of the ocean in the water. I mean, it's peaceful and tranquil. The very next day, the wind could blow up and have a big storm with several foot waves in the same space. But it is, and I like that. I mean, because for me, books are not just the content, but I like the tangible feel of a book and how it looks, how it presents. My doctoral dissertation down below, you see red flags and lace coifs. It's the poster behind me on the wall here, which was locally made, commemorating a strike of the women's fish processing strike in the early 19th century in Brittany and France. And I really wanted that image on the cover, and I worked with a book publisher, which is University of Toronto Press, and they do that. And their designers took the idea of flipping the image. Because if you use the classic way where you just run it horizontally the way it does, it looks kind of staid and academic. Of course, it is an academic book. and it has a sense of movement and design, and it speaks to that experience, and I think I like that, and I've always liked that about doing the books and stuff, as much about how it is as an object. I mean, the content is important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I make my livelihood putting words together, so I want people to pay attention to the words. but I also have a feel for the materiality of the object that's so important. And I think that's probably rooted to my own sense of self and place and where I'm coming from, that the material experience of being in these places and these in different ways bring people into some element of what I thought was important about these places. Having always been interested in doing film production, I mean, I turned down an opportunity to go to a film program in the States just because they were so outrageously expensive. And as a Canadian kid working on the fish boats, even though fish prices were high, it just wasn't really in the picture. But taking the idea of film and thinking I could just translate my social science notepad taking by recording everything on footage, and not realizing just how much more work that created for me. Because now not only did I have to take my field notes, which I had already coded by handwriting, which is one thing, but now I had the whole verbatim experience, everything I missed, plus technically speaking, it didn't make for good copy because it was so static. There was no no movement, except in one scene, there was the woman we were interviewing, her little white poodle type dog kept popping up into the frame, which isn't the kind of dynamic action you're really looking for in a serious documentary about First Nations harvesting forest products. But it is important. I mean, I always think about how do you bring people into place, both the kind of this sense of being there. I guess nowadays there's the fancy theory about affect theory. People talk about the affective dynamic that the experience goes. But sometimes the audience doesn't get what's in the film. I know one time I took a clip that I thought was really powerful, showing the matriarchal power and authority in Gitxaaڵa. And I was showing it a clip, a rough cut of a film we did called Backlance, and I was just showing these little clips from it. And I was at this anthropological conference, and there was a number of experts in Indigenous film in the audience. And one gentleman afterwards stood up who was well noted in this world, and said, "What a sad, sad, sad day for Indigenous people." And I thought, oh, okay, I'm not sure I'm watching the same program here, but he says, "You see how that graduate student, the white anthropologist, comes roaring in with their book of knowledge and pushes the matriarch to the edge of the screen, and she has to whisper that she's going to ask the old ladies back in the village for what the truth of the story is." And I said, okay, we clearly have things wrong here. First off, the matriarch in question was being considered of the sensibilities of the graduate student, who didn't know really what they were talking about, and that was okay for her. She knew the film videographer. It wasn't me, it was a colleague of mine who was doing the thing, and she was basically very politely saying to the person she knew that, well, we'll test the truth when we get back home with the real expert, not to worry, we don't have to disrupt the scene. So I looked at that and said, well, how do I have to re-edit this in a way that particular audience will understand that it's not an example of colonial displacement. In fact, it's quite the reverse. It's a demonstration of actual cultural protocol and respect and variation that's happening. And whereas the graduate student is learning the ropes without necessarily realizing that she's learning anything, because how people are responding and moving around her, building her capacity in the process. So thinking about how the audience hears, and sometimes even whether you care about what the audience thinks, which is another question too. But it's a little bit. But so this film, we shifted it and rolled it around. But the other thing, I always loved showing it to my first year anthropology course, and but it's a big class. You've got several hundred kids in the room, and they're all 18 or 19. There's a few slightly older, but they're in that kind of fresh out of the high school system, and they're in this space. They watch this film, which is in many cases, is very serious. There's hereditary leaders talking about rights and title in Gitxaaڵa and the territory and the problems of colonialism, and there's all this discussion. And then one day, one of my TAs, after showing this film several years without noticing any kind of bumps in the road, one of the TAs came to me and said, "I had a problem in tutorial last day." And I said, "Oh, explain it to me." And she said, well, one of the students said, "How come Indians are always angry at white people?" And I go, "Oh, how did we handle that?" She says, "Not very well, unfortunately. The whole class blew up afterwards, everyone arguing with each other." So I started thinking about it. So what's happening here? And so part of it is that we live in a society, a modern society, that always tells youth, you are the leadership today. In fact, not you're the leadership today, you're the leadership right now. And we're going to empower your voice to speak. And here is a culture and a community that says, yes, youth are important. Sit quietly, listen carefully, exercise the learnings and protocols, and you too will come to this place because you are our future and we're doing this for you. But also speaking in that very serious tone that you hear in the feast hall, which is quite different than many youth are accustomed to us being venerating, not venerating is the wrong word, but elevating their opinions and perspectives and speaking in a different kind of tone. So it's perceived as angry. So I said, well, I really don't want to cause too much anxiety with my incoming students, because I want them to get the lesson about the way in which culture works, the politics works, the whole dynamics. So how can we do this differently? And I was thinking, well, sport. The all-native basketball tournament in Prince Rupert. So we did a film about sport where people are laughing, playing games, still talking about the seriousness of the political work, the impact and the importance of having the all-native tournament. People say, well, how come it's an all-native tournament? And there's all kinds of good reasons why. I mean, it's a historical confluence about the fact that this is the only place that First Nations could play basketball for many years, was in separate, segregated leagues. I mean, this is the idea. So now it becomes a center of power and cultural pride. It becomes like a winter celebration up in Prince Rupert. But changing the dynamic, thinking of film as an intervention into a teaching moment, but thinking about how I want to play with the audience in ways that in some cases you do want to antagonize your audience. Not necessarily a good idea for feature film production and mass market film work, but not always does one want to do that. Oftentimes you really want to bring people along with you.